The story opens on a blistering afternoon in a frontier town where dust swirls in the air, kicked up by wagon wheels and boots. The center of activity is the town square, where a wooden platform has been erected for the auction. Horses are tethered. Nearby, restless and neighing, their coats glistening with sweat. The auctioneer's voice booms across the crowd, sharp as a whip, drawing attention to each item up for bid. Farmers, ranchers, and drifters lean on fence rails, their pockets heavy with coins or light with hope. The atmosphere is both lively and grim. Livestock, tools, wagons, and sometimes even people willing to trade labor for board are paraded across the block. It's a place where fortunes shift in the blink of an eye, where a strong stallion might mean survival for a rancher, or a bad bargain might drag a man into debt. Amid the bidding, there's laughter from some, curses from others, and always the sharp bark of the auctioneer trying to whip excitement from the crowd. Into this restless scene rides the rancher, a tall, broad man whose very presence commands attention. He's known in town but not much loved, for he keeps to himself and rarely lingers. He dismounts his horse with quiet authority, his boots striking the packed earth with the certainty of a man who doesn't waste words. He hasn't come for spectacle, he's come for business. His ranch is struggling, and he needs a horse, strong, fast, and reliable, to pull through the season ahead. That is his only purpose here, or so he tells himself. But woven into the noise and trade of the auction is another story, that of the girl. She stands on the edge of the crowd, thin but proud, her clothes patched and worn. Her eyes scan the proceedings with a mixture of fear and determination. She has no cattle, no land, and no family left. Her parents, once owners of a modest homestead, were claimed by illness, and the land they worked was swallowed by greedy creditors. She has survived these past months on scraps and charity, but her luck has run dry. Alone in the world, she knows she is one step away from ruin. The auction, for her, is not about horses or wagons. It is about possibility. Watching others barter and shout, she weighs her own choices. She cannot bid. She has nothing of value to offer but herself. The thought chills her, but it also steels her. In a world where women often have little say, she realizes her only chance of survival is to make herself seen, and to do it boldly. As the rancher makes his way closer to the platform, the auctioneer begins announcing the prize of the day, a muscular stallion, wild-eyed and fierce, known to throw weaker riders. The crowd surges with interest. Bidding starts, shouts ring out, and the price climbs higher with every call. Men elbow one another, waving their hands, eager to stake their claim. The rancher narrows his gaze, calculating. This is the horse he came for, the one that could make or break his ranch's future. He prepares to enter the bidding when a sudden, sharp voice cuts across the noise. It's the girl. She pushes her way through the throng, climbing up onto the block beside the stallion, her chin raised, her eyes blazing. Dust clings to her skirts, but her spirit burns bright. In that instant, the world seems to stop. Men gape, the auctioneer stutters mid-sentence, and even the horse paws the ground nervously. The girl's voice rings out clear and fierce, words that will shock the crowd and bind her fate to the rancher. Dust had hardly settled from her outburst when the crowd erupted in whispers and laughter. But before we dive into that moment, the reader needs to understand why the girl was driven to such desperation. Her story, quietly unfolding in the shadows before the auction, makes her bold cry not one of shame but of survival. She had been born into hardship, though her parents once dreamed of something better. They owned a small stretch of land on the outskirts of town, a patch of earth that barely yielded enough crops to feed them, let alone bring in profit. Still, it was home. Her father was a stubborn man who worked the soil with cracked hands, and her mother was the heart of the household, holding it together with gentle laughter and warm meals, even when both were scarce. But fate can be cruel on the frontier. A fever swept through the settlement one harsh winter, leaving her parents weak and bedridden. The girl, still young but old enough to shoulder responsibility, tried to care for them. She foraged, begged neighbors for help, and bartered whatever little they had left. Yet the fever claimed them both within weeks, leaving her with nothing but a shallow grave to tend and debts she could not pay. The creditors came quickly, as they always do. Men who wore fine coats and smug expressions, holding papers stamped with law and authority. They took the homestead, the tools, and even her mother's last quilt, leaving her with only the clothes on her back. In the town's eyes, she became a stray, another orphan girl without kin or worth, too proud to beg and too unskilled to hire. Still, she survived. For months, she scraped by on odd jobs, sweeping floors at the saloon, helping a seamstress until she was no longer needed, and washing dishes at the boarding house. Each job gave her just enough coins for bread, never enough to plan for tomorrow. And tomorrow, always, came too quickly. What weighed most heavily on her, however, wasn't hunger. It was the constant gaze of men who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. Whispers followed her, offers disguised as kindness. She was propositioned, more than once, and though she spat at the idea, she knew her defiance only put her in more danger. Alone, without brothers or a father to protect her, she carried herself with an iron spine, hoping her fire would be enough to keep wolves at bay. But wolves circle when they smell weakness, and she knew her strength was fading. That morning, when she walked to the auction block, her decision had already been made. She had no land to sell, no goods to trade, no dowry to tempt. The only thing she still possessed was herself, her hands, her will, her body, her heart. She told herself she would not be sold like cattle. No, she would offer herself on her own terms, not as a servant, but as a partner. The rancher, in her mind, was the only man worth the gamble. She had seen him before, a quiet figure in town, a man who commanded respect without cruelty. He wasn't like the others who leered at her when she walked by. He carried loneliness, yes, but also a kind of unspoken decency. In her heart, she convinced herself that if there was any man who might see her as more than a desperate mouth to feed, it would be him. So when she climbed onto the block and shouted her challenge, it was not madness. It was a final, daring throw of the dice. She would rather give herself boldly to one man of honor than waste away slowly under the scorn of many. And though her voice trembled at first, by the time her declaration echoed across the square, it carried the fire of someone who refused to be forgotten. Don't buy the horse. Buy me, rancher. I'm forever yours. Before the rancher can respond to the girl's desperate outcry, the story pauses to explore who he is and why the crowd's eyes instantly turn to him with both curiosity and awe. His reputation has preceded him, and in this town, reputation can be as binding as law. The rancher's name is murmured among the gathering, spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness. He is not a man of many words, but his presence alone is enough to silence fools and steady drunkards. Broad-shouldered, weathered from years under the relentless sun, his hands calloused from rope and reins, he is every inch the picture of a man molded by the land. Yet it is not just his size that commands attention. It is the aura of restraint and solitude that clings to him. He runs one of the toughest spreads west of the river, a ranch known for hard work and good stock. Those who labor for him say he is fair, paying what he owes without complaint. But his standards are high. He works beside his men, rising before dawn and shouldering burdens without a word of grievance. He is not known to drink heavily, nor to waste time in the saloon, and though women glance his way, none have ever claimed his heart. But whispers follow him nonetheless. Years ago, there was a woman, his intended bride. Some say she died of fever before the wedding. Others claim she left him for a man with more money and prospects. The truth is known only to him, and he has never spoken of it. Whatever the cause, that old wound turned him inward. Instead of seeking companionship, he buried himself in the soil, in cattle, in sweat. His ranch grew, but his life remained empty, of laughter and warmth. This self-imposed solitude has earned him a reputation that is both enviable and isolating. Men trust his judgment in matters of land and stock, but few dare to call him friend. Children sometimes whisper that he is a giant who eats alone at his table, his only company the sound of the wind across the prairie. Women watch him ride into town with guarded eyes, wondering if the silence hides a broken heart, or a heart too cold to ever be mended. Still, despite the mystery, there is one truth that all agree on. He is honorable. He does not cheat. He does not strike a man unfairly. He does not take what is not his. In a frontier where greed and cruelty often rule, that alone sets him apart. It is for this reason that the girl, desperate and trembling, dares to call out to him. She sees in him not just strength, but decency. The rare kind of decency that might allow her to survive with dignity rather than shame. To her, he is not merely a man with land and means. He is the last gamble of a life on the edge of ruin, when her words, "Don't buy the horse, buy me, rancher, I'm forever yours," slice through the heat and dust of the auction grounds. The crowd reacts less to her boldness than to the weight of his silence. Every eye turns to him, waiting. Some smirk, imagining his pride stung. Others whisper wagers on whether he'll take her at her word or turn his back. A few women gasp, horrified by the scandal. But the rancher does not flinch. His face, weathered and unreadable, betrays nothing of the storm inside. His jaw tightens, his eyes flicker between the trembling girl and the restless stallion beside her. The air seems to thicken, heavy with anticipation. For this is no ordinary man, and the choice before him is no ordinary decision. His reputation, built on silence, solitude, and honor, will be tested in the most public of ways. And the girl, desperate though she is, has chosen well, for if there is a man in this town who could turn her cry of despair into something greater, it is him. The auction yard was never meant for drama beyond the clang of coins and the rumble of bids. Men came for horses, cattle, wagons, maybe tools, but never for hearts or vows. That's why, when the girl climbed onto the block and let her words ring out, the entire square seemed to freeze in disbelief. The auctioneer, mid-chant, nearly swallowed his own tongue. His gavel hung in the air, motionless, while his eyes bulged, like a startled ox. The prized stallion beside the girl stamped and tossed its mane, as if sensing the sudden crackle in the air. And then her voice carried again, louder, braver, burning through the mockery already rising from the crowd. "Don't buy the horse. Buy me, rancher. I'm forever yours." For a heartbeat, silence fell. Every man, woman, and child present turned their gaze from the horse to the girl, and then, inevitably, to the tall rancher standing near the front. The reaction came fast. A ripple of laughter broke out from the rougher men in the crowd, half amusement, half cruelty. Some slapped, their knees hooting at the audacity. A few called out jokes, turning the moment into cheap entertainment. "Guess the girl's cheaper than the stallion," one shouted. "Careful, rancher, she'll buck harder than that horse," another jeered. But beneath the laughter was something else, an undercurrent of shock. Women whispered behind gloved hands, scandalized at her boldness. Respectable matrons shook their heads, muttering about shame and sin. Children stared wide-eyed, caught between awe and confusion. And the auctioneer, red-faced and sputtering, tried to regain control of his stage. Now, this here's a livestock sale, not a—" He cut himself off, realizing the words were fueling the frenzy instead of quelling it. The girl stood firm, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, but her chin remained high. She did not cower. At the laughter or the whispers, every ounce of her attention was fixed on the rancher. It was as though no one else existed, not the jeering men, not the scandalized women, not the gaping auctioneer. Just him, and that, more than her words, shocked the crowd. For all her poverty and desperation, there was something fierce in her stance. She was not begging, not pleading. She was offering. Her declaration was not the pitiful cry of a girl cornered by hunger. It was the bold demand of someone staking her future on a man's honor. The rancher himself did not move at first. His broad hat cast a shadow over his face, leaving only his eyes visible, sharp, unyielding, but unreadable. He stood with his hands at his sides, boots planted firm in the dust, the weight of every gaze pressing on him. The crowd waited for his reaction, like gamblers leaning over dice. Inside, however, the rancher's heart shifted. He was no stranger to hard bargains, to choosing between survival and pride, but this was no ordinary trade. Her words cut through the noise of his carefully walled-off life, stirring something he had long buried. A memory of what it meant to be needed, a reminder of what it felt like to have someone look at him, not for his land, his cattle, or his strength, but for him, yet the very idea of buying a woman went against everything he stood for. He had seen men treat wives and workers like property, and he despised it. Was he to join them now? Could he accept her bold plea without trampling his own code? The crowd's impatience grew. A drunk near the back shouted, "What's the matter, rancher? Ain't she good enough?" Another chimed in, "Take her and be done with it. We came here for a sale." The laughter roared again, but this time with a meaner edge. Still the rancher remained silent, locked in the storm of his own thoughts. And the girl, her lips trembling but her eyes unbroken, lifted her voice once more. Not softer, not ashamed, but stronger. "I'm not afraid of work. I'm not afraid of you, but I won't beg another man. If you'll have me, I'm yours." The words struck like a hammer against the silence that followed. The crowd was no longer merely amused. They were enthralled, waiting to see what this man, this silent giant of the prairie, would do. Because in that moment, everyone understood. The rancher's choice would not just decide her fate, it would set the course for his own. The girl's words still echoed in the air when silence fell over the auction yard, thick, heavy, and absolute. Even the stallion beside her seemed to quiet, its restless stomping reduced to a soft snort. The crowd, moments ago roaring with laughter and mockery, held its collective breath, waiting for the rancher's answer. Every eye was fixed on him. The jeers had died, but their weight still lingered, pressing down like storm clouds. The townsfolk wanted a show. To them, this was entertainment, a story to gossip about for weeks. Would the stoic rancher shame the girl, turning his back on her desperate cry? Or would he step forward, claim her, and confirm the scandal everyone secretly craved? The rancher stood motionless. His broad frame cast a long shadow in the dust, and his weathered face was carved into unreadable stillness. Only his eyes moved, steady and piercing, locked on the girl who stood trembling atop the block. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her lips tight, but her gaze did not waver. For a long, breathless moment, it seemed like the whole world balanced on the edge of his decision. Inside, the rancher wrestled with himself. He had faced stampedes, drought, and seasons of hunger, but this was different. The girl's outcry wasn't a plea to be saved so much as a dare to see her worth. And that struck something deep in him, something he thought had withered long ago. Yet how could he answer? If he agreed, would it not mean treating her like property, as though she were no more than the stallion pawing the ground beside her? His honor rebelled against the very thought. But if he refused her, if he turned his back now, he would leave her to the wolves of the town, men who would snatch her up with lecherous grins, not out of respect, but out of hunger. The crowd began to murmur again, impatience bubbling beneath the silence. "Well," someone barked. "Don't keep us waiting, rancher!" another shouted. The auctioneer, sweating under his hat, tried to regain control. He banged his gavel against the block, but the sound was feeble, meaningless against the storm brewing in the square. Still, the rancher said nothing. His silence was more powerful than any words the others might throw, and in that silence, the girl's courage faltered for the first time. Her chin wavered, her shoulders trembled, and though she fought, a flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. Had she gambled everything on a man who would not take the risk? The rancher saw it, that flicker, and it pierced him deeper than the mockery of the crowd ever could. Because beneath her fire and her boldness, she was still just a girl standing, on the edge of despair, clinging to hope with the last of her strength. His jaw tightened. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, boots crunching in the dust. The crowd leaned in as one, gasping, murmuring. Each step he took deepened the tension, until even the mocking men fell silent. He stopped at the edge of the platform. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Not at her patched dress, not at her thin frame, but at her eyes. Those defiant, trembling eyes that dared him to see her not as chattel, but as something more. And in that silence, his decision began to take shape. He would not shame her. He would not let her fall into the hands of men who saw her as a prize to be bought and used, but neither would he buy her in the way the crowd expected. The rancher's silence, heavy as iron, was not indecision, it was resolve hardening like steel. The girl could sense it. The crowd could feel it. Something was about to happen that would turn mockery into stunned disbelief. But for now, the silence held, drawn tight like a bowstring, ready to snap. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air, his throat working nervously as he tried to wrangle back control. The crowd pressed closer, eager for the rancher's answer, some sneering, some grinning, all of them hungry for spectacle. The girl stood trembling but unyielding, her chin tilted high, daring fate to fall one way or the other. The rancher finally moved. He stepped forward, not toward the bidding line, but straight past the crowd and up to the auctioneer's stand. The murmurs rose to a hum, confusion, disbelief, irritation. Men craned their necks trying to see what he was doing. The auctioneer stammered, caught between his usual bravado and the strange weight of the moment. Sir, if it's the horse you want, the bidding's still—" But the rancher cut him off, his voice low and firm, carrying easily over the restless crowd. "I'm not bidding." A hush fell again. Those 3 words landed heavier than any gavel could. The rancher reached into his coat, pulled out a pouch of coins, and dropped it onto the auctioneer's table. The jingle of silver rang sharp in the stillness. "That covers the stallion," he said, "and whatever debts the girl owes, paid in full." The crowd erupted. Shouts, protests, laughter, outrage, everyone speaking at once. That's not how an auction works. He's buying her after all. Coward won't even— "Bid proper," the auctioneer sputtered, holding up his hands. Now! This is highly irregular." The rancher's eyes cut to him, sharp as a knife. "You'll take the money, call it a fee, call it a debt cleared, call it whatever you like, but it's done." His tone brooked no argument, and the auctioneer, despite himself, swallowed hard and nodded. Then the rancher turned, not to the crowd, not to the horse, but to the girl. His gaze was steady, firm, but softened by something no one expected. He extended his hand, not like a man claiming property, but like a man offering choice. "You don't belong to me," he said. "Not now, not ever. You're free. But if you've got nowhere to go, my ranch has room for workers who are willing to earn their keep." The words cut clean through the jeers. For a moment, even the loudest hecklers fell silent, stunned. The rancher hadn't bought her like chattel. He hadn't claimed her as his possession. He had rescued her debts, silenced her tormentors, and still offered her dignity. The girl's breath caught in her chest. Her whole body trembled, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what he had just done. Her outburst, her desperate gamble, had not been met with scorn or mockery. He had seen her, truly seen her, and instead of binding her down, he had opened a door. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. Some muttered that he was a fool, wasting good money on a girl who should have been left to her fate. Others whispered that it was the most honorable thing they'd seen in years. A few men, jealous and bitter, clenched their fists, already plotting what they might do about this unexpected turn. The girl, however, heard none of it. Her gaze locked on the rancher's outstretched hand. It wasn't just an offer of work. It was a lifeline. A chance to step out of the shadows of shame and into a future she had almost stopped believing in. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached down and placed her hand in his. The roughness of his palm met the softness of hers, sealing, a promise unspoken but understood. The rancher gave a single nod, then helped her down from the block. Together, they walked past the stunned crowd toward the stallion, which the rancher now claimed without a word. Whispers followed them like wind through grass, but neither looked back. For the girl, it was the first step into a life no longer dictated by desperation. For the rancher, it was the beginning of a decision that would change more than just his ranch. It would change the walls around his heart. And though the auction continued behind them, no one would forget the moment when silence, honor, and choice had spoken louder than any bid. The sun hung low over the horizon as the auction yard slowly emptied. Dust still lingered in the air, stirred by boots, wagon wheels, and restless hooves. But the clamor had faded. The rancher, having settled the matter with a pouch of silver, led the stallion by its reins, while the girl walked a few paces behind. Their departure was quiet, almost unremarkable compared to the chaos they left behind. But every eye followed them until they disappeared down the dirt road. For the girl, each step away from the square was like leaving behind a noose she hadn't realized was around her neck. She clutched the strap of her small bundle, a pitiful collection of belongings, little more than a faded shawl, a tin cup, and the ribbon her mother once tied in her hair. Yet even with so little, she felt lighter, freed from debts, from creditors, from the hungry stares of men who had seen her desperation as opportunity. Still, she could not shake the heat of humiliation. The words she had shouted, bold as thunder, now echoed in her mind. "Don't buy the horse. Buy me, rancher. I'm forever yours." She bit her lip. Was he mocking her in silence, walking ahead, without a word? Did he see her as reckless, a burden he had been forced to shoulder? Shame burned in her chest, though she fought to keep her chin lifted. The rancher, for his part, was equally silent. He held the stallion's reins firmly, his jaw tight, his thoughts turning like wheels in deep mud. He had not planned for this. He had come for a horse, nothing more. Yet he now found himself with not only the stallion but also a girl who had bound her fate to his with one desperate cry. His mind circled the questions. Had he done the right thing? Was she truly strong enough to withstand the harsh life on his ranch, where the days were long and the work left no room for weakness? More troubling still, why had her words struck him so deeply? The fire in her voice, the courage in her eyes, had pierced through the walls he'd spent years building. He told himself it was pity that made him act, nothing more. But pity alone could not explain the strange weight pressing against his chest. Each time he thought of her trembling hand in his. The road stretched ahead, winding out of town and into the wide expanse of prairie. Shadows grew long, the golden light softening the harsh edges of the land. The girl's steps faltered once or twice, but she kept pace, determined not to appear weak. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke. "You didn't have to do it," she said softly. The rancher didn't look back. "Yes, I did," her brow furrowed. "But I'm not yours. You made that plain. You could have walked away." He stopped, turning to face her. His eyes, sharp and steady, met hers with a weight that pinned her breath. "If I'd walked away, you'd be in someone else's hands right now, someone without honor. I won't stand by and let that happen." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not possession, not pity, protection. She nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat, and the two continued in silence. As dusk bled into night, they reached the edge of his land. The ranch stretched wide, rolling hills, weathered fences, cattle grazing in the distance, and a sturdy house that stood against the sky like a sentinel. To the girl it looked vast, lonely, and unyielding, much like the man himself. She shivered in the cooling air, clutching her bundle tighter. The rancher glanced at her, noting the exhaustion etched into her face, and for the first time, his voice softened. "There's supper inside, a place to sleep. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the work." It was not a promise of love nor a claim of ownership, but in its steadiness, its quiet certainty, the girl felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. And though the distance between them still stretched wide, the journey to the ranch marked the first step toward closing it. The first. Days at the ranch tested the girl more than she could have imagined. The land was rugged, the work relentless, and the silence of the wide prairie felt heavier than the noisy gossip of town. Dawn came early, long before the sun crested the horizon, and the chores stretched deep into the evening. The rancher wasted no time explaining what was expected. He didn't speak harshly, nor did he soften his words. "This isn't charity," he told her that first morning as they stood by the corral. "If you stay, you work. If you work, you eat. That's the way of it." She nodded, chin set, determined not to falter. She had begged for this chance. In front of the whole town, no less. She would prove she was worth it. At first, her hands blistered from the rough rope, and her arms ached from hauling buckets of water. She burned her fingers over the stove trying to cook for men who had eaten plain fare all their lives. More than once she stumbled into bed so exhausted she wept quietly into her pillow. But she rose each morning with grit in her bones, refusing to give him or herself reason to believe she was weak. The rancher noticed. Though he kept his distance, he saw the way she carried herself. She didn't shirk, didn't complain, didn't wilt under hardship. When a calf escaped the pen one afternoon, he half expected her to scream or flail, but she ran after it, skirts flying, and cornered the creature with a stubbornness that made his ranch hands laugh and slap their knees. She returned, panting and red-faced, but proud. The rancher allowed the faintest twitch of a smile before resuming his work. Meals became a turning point. At first, the men teased her for her clumsy cooking, but she learned quickly. Within weeks, she was serving hearty stews and fresh bread that filled bellies and softened moods. The hands began to look at her less as an outsider and more as part of the place. The rancher never said so outright, but his silence when others praised her spoke volumes. Trust, however, is not built only on labor. It grows in small, quiet moments. One evening, after a long day, she found the rancher repairing a fence post by lantern light. Without asking, she picked up a hammer and helped hold the board steady. He glanced at her, surprised, but said nothing. They worked side by side until the fence stood firm. When the last nail was driven, he offered her a simple nod, but in his eyes lingered respect. Another time, she tended to a sick colt, staying up through the night to cool its fever with damp cloths. When the rancher found her asleep in the straw at dawn, the colt's head nestled in her lap. Something shifted in him. He didn't wake her. Instead, he stood there for a long while, studying the girl who had bargained her fate so boldly, and wondered if she was healing something in him he hadn't known was broken. The girl, for her part, began to see the man behind the silence. His solitude was not coldness, but caution. He worked harder than anyone, often pushing himself past exhaustion, as though the land itself demanded his penance. But when he thought no one watched, he'd pause to stroke a horse's muzzle with surprising gentleness, or let his gaze linger on the horizon as if searching for something lost long. Each day, the walls between them thinned. She stopped calling him sir and began using his name. He, in turn, stopped referring to her as the girl when speaking to his men. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to move not as two strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners carrying the weight of the ranch together. Trust, fragile and hard-won, had begun to take root. Neither spoke of the words shouted at the bidding block, but both carried them still. Hers with a blush of memory, his with a quiet stirring. He had not felt in years, and though neither dared to say it aloud, the ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was beginning to feel like home. For weeks, the girl and the rancher worked side by side, building a rhythm on the ranch that felt steady, almost safe. But life on the frontier rarely allows peace to linger long. The outside world, gossips, rivals, and bitter men, had not forgotten the scandal of the auction block. In town, tongues wagged every day. At the mercantile, women whispered that the girl had thrown herself at the rancher in shameful desperation. At the saloon, rough men laughed that the rancher had paid for a wife like one buys a mule. Some sneered at his honor, others envied his luck. The truth mattered less than the stories people told, and stories have a way of growing teeth. Among those listening was a man named Calder Boone, a rancher whose pride was as large as his debts. Boone had been at the auction that day, and though he had laughed with the rest, something in him had curdled. He had eyed the girl before, thinking she might make a useful wife, or at least a possession to bolster his standing. When she dared to choose publicly, and not him but the man he envied most, Boone's humiliation festered into anger. Boone began spreading his own rumors. He claimed the girl had been his for the taking, that she had offered herself to him before she ever shouted on the block. He called her untrustworthy, a liar, a fallen woman. At first, these were only words, but words on the frontier can stir men to action as surely as whiskey or a loaded pistol. Trouble came quietly at first. Supplies ordered by the rancher arrived late or short. Fences were found cut in the night, cattle spooked and driven off course. The rancher suspected sabotage, though no one ever saw the culprit. The girl, however, became the sharper target. When she went into town alone to buy flour, men muttered insults loud enough for her to hear. Some cornered her, suggesting she belonged to the highest bidder and ought not act so proud. She returned shaken but unbroken, her eyes flashing with the same defiance she had shown on the block. "Let them talk," she told the rancher. "I won't crawl." But he saw the weight she carried. He noticed the way her hands trembled when she thought no one watched, the way she avoided the town unless necessary. It gnawed at him. Her courage was iron, but she should not have to face this fight alone. One evening, as the two shared supper, the rancher finally spoke. "This won't stop," he said, his voice low. "Boone and the rest, they'll keep coming until they break something. Maybe you. Maybe this ranch." The girl set her spoon down, her gaze steady. "Then let them come. I won't leave. Not after everything we've built here." The rancher studied her in silence, torn between admiration and a fierce protective instinct that burned hotter each day. He had rescued her from debts, but now he felt the need to rescue her again, this time not from poverty, but from cruelty. The tension boiled over when Boone himself rode out to the ranch, swaggering as though he owned the land beneath his boots. He brought 2 hired hands and a mouthful of venom. Standing in the yard, he announced loud enough for all to hear that the girl belonged with him, that she was a liar who had tricked the rancher into buying her, and that he had the right to claim her now. The girl standing by the corral went pale but did not flinch. The rancher stepped forward, shoulders squared, his shadow falling long across the dirt. His voice carried like a whip crack. "She belongs to no man, least of all you, Boone. You'll leave this place, and you'll not set foot on it again." Boone's face twisted, but the steel in the rancher's tone and the set of his jaw left no doubt. This was not a man who bluffed. Boone spat in the dirt, muttered threats under his breath, and rode off, but everyone knew it wasn't the end. The girl exhaled shakily, her strength returning only when she felt the rancher's steady gaze on her. Trouble had arrived at their door, but for the first time she realized they would face it together. And perhaps, just perhaps, the fire between them would only grow stronger in the storm. The storm broke not with rain, but with iron and fire. Boone, stung by the rancher's public defiance, returned under cover of night with a small gang of men willing to trade loyalty for coin and whiskey. Their aim was simple: break fences, scatter cattle, burn what could not be stolen, and leave. The rancher humbled. But beneath Boone's bluster lay a darker intent. He wanted the girl. To him, she was no more than a prize, proof that no man could deny him what he desired. The girl woke first to the sound of distant hooves and the sharp yelp of dogs. She rushed to the window and saw lanterns bobbing in the dark, shadows moving. Quick across the yard, heart pounding, she shook the rancher awake. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, eyes hard as stone. "Stay inside," he ordered, but she shook her head fiercely. "No, not this time. I won't hide while they destroy what's ours." For a heartbeat, his gaze locked with hers. A silent battle between his need to shield her and her determination to stand by him. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Then stay close." The night erupted in chaos. Flames licked the edge of the hay, barn, and cattle bellowed in panic as Boone's men tried to drive them into the open. Shots rang out, sharp and echoing. The rancher returned fire with precision, his silhouette fierce against the glow of firelight. The girl, though trembling, loaded cartridges with steady hands, passing them to him without falter. When Boone charged, forward, shouting her name like a claim, the girl's fear hardened into defiance. She stepped into the open lantern light, catching her face, and her voice rang out across the yard. "You'll never have me, Boone. I wasn't yours to take then, and I'll never be yours now." Her words cut sharper than bullets. Boone faltered, his pride wounded before his men. In that instant, the rancher struck, knocking Boone to the ground, rifle barrel pressed against his chest. The yard fell silent except for the crackle of burning hay. "Leave," the rancher growled, his voice steady with deadly intent. "Take your dogs with you. If I see you on my land again, I won't give you the chance to ride away." Humiliated, Boone spat curses but obeyed, scrambling to his horse. His men, shaken by the show of defiance, scattered into the night. The flames were beaten back, the cattle calmed, and the ranch stood, scarred but unbroken. When the dust settled, the rancher turned to the girl. She was streaked with soot, her hands raw, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. Yet her eyes shone with a fire that matched his own. He stepped closer, his voice low but fierce. "You were braver than any man tonight." Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze. "I didn't shout those words on the block because I wanted saving. I shouted them because I knew. You were the one I could give my whole heart to. I'm not afraid of work, or hardship, or even men, like Boone. I'm only afraid of losing you." The rancher, a man who had spent years building walls of silence, felt them crumble in the heat of her confession. He reached for her hand, rough against rough, and lifted it to his lips. "You'll never lose me," he murmured. You gave me no choice the moment you shouted across that square. You said you were forever mine, and I reckon you were right. But what I didn't say then is that I'm forever yours too." The girl's breath caught, tears slipping free, but they were tears of relief, of joy, of something hard-won and deeply real. In the yard, still smelling of smoke and ash, they embraced, not as master and servant, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals who had fought side by side and chosen each other. The ranch survived, and so did they. Whispers in town would fade, Boone's shadow would pass, and life on the prairie would remain hard. But from that night on, the girl and the rancher carried a bond forged in fire, trust, and unspoken devotion. Forever wasn't just a promise shouted in desperation anymore. It was the life they would build day by day together.